Hi, everyone. I would remind you to shut down your devices, or mute them at the very least. And also, if you can answer the survey after the talk, would be interesting. All right. You guys are ready? Yeah. Okay. All right, so my name is Julien, and I'm a technical lead at Ubisoft Montreal. And this is The Art of Destruction. So, how many of you have played Rainbow Six? Yeah. All right. Well, that's pretty good. So, as you probably know, there's a lot of destruction in Rainbow Six Siege. I mean, it's literally the core feature of the game as far as gameplay is concerned. So, how did we actually make it so? That's a lot of things happening, and I'll cover that. And you know, we started from pretty humble beginnings and made it into a really nice feature. So, let's start. So what's procedural destruction? Well, first thing, it can be a lot of different things, different techniques. But let's just generalize it and say it's a change in the state of an object that's really generated at runtime. So you can have a different input, different output. So the outcome can be really unique, which is totally in a position to pre-fragment the destruction, which most games do, where the outcome is really fixed. I mean, you have a vase that breaks, it's always going to break the same, always going to be the same pieces, whether you ram it with a car, a baseball bat, or, you know, with a bullet. So, let's go back to our story. In late 2012, we were given the mandate to come up with Procedural Glass for Rainbow Six. So, that was, we already had done like a lot of destruction before, but, you know, we came up with something like this. So, this looks really simple, but we're really creating new geometry at runtime. It looks good. We changed the normals, we applied decals. And that was, 3 years ago, or more than that. And that really was a changing point for the project. They really liked it, so we generalized to other materials, and then they kind of clicked. Wow, we could actually have a game based on destruction. So they gave some resources, and we did a concept tech demo in early 2013, which is very cool and takes more or less place in the Montreal studio. So that was really a benchmark for destruction for a really long time internally. A lot of people worked on it, and I mean, it does look very good for something that's 3 years old. So here with, you know, we had Boolean 3D destruction at the time with wood breaking, bricks breaking, we have windows, floors, ceilings, what have you, explosions, bullets, a lot of particles. That looks very cool. Of course, pre-fragmented destruction. I mean, you might as well do it. And that worked really nicely. Of course, at that time, that wasn't 60 FPS. That wasn't robust. That was not online. We had literally no tools for it, so we had a lot of work to cover to make it in a real feature. So, let it run a while. But you get the idea. I mean, you start with something super clean, you shoot, destroy, and you end up with something like this. It does really strike the imagination a bit, right? So, all right, fast forward to late 2015, we've released Rainbow Six. It's a pretty good success. It worked really nicely. So the actual tech and, you know, the concept didn't change a lot in those 3 years, right? Or nearly 3 years. But we've had a lot of steps to do to make it work. So that's what I'm actually going to talk about in this talk, right? So first, I'll talk about Realblast, which is really the team, the product, everything. Then, you know, how destruction is made for Rainbow Six Siege. Now you could actually think about your potential destruction solution, or, you know, whatever feature you want to do would actually interact with the game. Then really dive in our, you know, variety of destruction technology, and then talk about performance and online, which are really two huge topics for Rainbow Six. And finally conclude. All right, so Realblast. We're a really small team, mostly programmers. We've been at it for a bit more than 5 years now, and we're part of the technology group, which I will come to a bit later. First out, shout out to Alex Ouimet. That helped me a lot for the presentation, and I mean, He's my esteemed colleague, so I work with him every day. All right, technology group. That's some kind of separate division inside Ubisoft where we do R&D and develop common technologies and promote sharing between productions. So we build up expertise on, destruction, dynamic nav mesh, UI, networking, animation, a lot of different things, which, in the end, we accumulate expertise and we essentially do mandates and productions and in the end make better games. So, Realblast. The product itself is, let's say, a complete destruction solution. We've preframed to destruction, procedural destruction, in runtime, so of course in the engine, but there's also some tools behind that, so everything that's used to generate the content, like fragmentation tools, which you can use in Max or Maya. We have a destruction properties editor, which is used to set up, let's say what kind of physics you want to use, what kind of procedural technique you want to use, and finally an external debugger so we can keep track of whatever is happening, because as you might know, if you try to debug complex geometry algorithms and you don't see anything, it's really painful. But the last 3 points I'm not actually going to talk about in this presentation because that would be a bit too long. But we are going to cover that in the Ubisoft booth at 4 today if you guys are interested. All right, collaborations. As I said before, we've been at it for a while, so we did mandates on a few productions. Some worked out, some didn't. But we really first shipped destruction with AC4 Black Flag, with the naval forts. And that worked nicely, they liked it. And then recently, of course, it's a core feature of Rainbow Six Siege. So let's dive into Rainbow Six Siege. For those who didn't play the game, let me summarize it really simply. You have attackers on one end, they want to get in, neutralize a threat, or rescue the hostage. They use means like destruction to get in and do everything, and then you have defenders on one end, on the other end, sorry, that want to block dispatcher, the attackers, invaders, and funnel. So there's really an asymmetric gameplay there. So where on one end you have destruction as a gameplay opportunity, so you can actually make path that you can go through, or you can make murder holes or kill holes so that you can shoot through walls. And on the other end, you can barricade, reinforce walls to prevent your opponents to go through. So it really opens up a lot the gameplay and makes it fresh so that every game is really different. So in practice, in the game, the environments are really like destructible elements are, there's only 4 of them, but they're really prevalent in the game. So you have trapdoors that really control the verticality of levels. You have barricades that, they don't block a lot, but they'll block visibility and make a lot of sound when they're broken. You have line of sight floors. So these you break and you can actually shoot through or send grenades through, but the player will never be able to go through. And of course you have breachable walls, which is definitely the iconic destruction of Rainbow Six Siege. So, okay. You think you've your destruction tech. That sounds simple, right? That's it. It worked 3 years ago. Let's just put it in game. Yeah, that's not that simple. So, let me drink a bit. All right. In reality, it does come at a pretty high price because you need, if you want to go with coherence and have environments that work for your players, you need to model destruction already because you'll be able to see through walls, you'll be able to see inside cupboards. So what's there in your cupboards? So it really ends up with a lot of destruction creep. Some stuff you wouldn't see before, you need to model now. So that's a lot of more work that your artists need to do. And they need to do it in a good way so that it's physically viable in your project. So you need to do some artist training because it'll change their modeling style. They'll need to know a bit more about physics because sometimes they don't. And then it's also a really huge game changer for designers. They'll need to come up with a visual language for destruction. But at the same time, it's a really cool new variable, a new toy they can play with. And finally, of course, nothing's ever free. It does cost something. It'll cost more on the physics side because you'll have more dynamic objects. And it'll cost more on the rendering side for a plethora of reasons, which I'll come back to later. And finally, your runtime destruction itself, it's not going to be free. So let's say you still want to bite in and you do it. then how do you actually interact with the other systems in the game? So one way to do it, which is the way we did it, is really simple. I mean, the game feeds you inputs, right? And that drives destruction. Destruction itself, it can be some kind of black box. But in the end, you can make it so that your output, the information you give back to the game, is structured in a way that everyone, every stakeholder has the information it needs to do its job. So it can be, what broke, what weapon was used, where are the parts now, and all kind of details. So you can feed that information for sound, effects, AI. Then, for example, just for AI navigation, you'll need to update your navig if the trapdoors are broken or if you've just breached your wall. You don't want your AI to be stuck and waiting by an open wall, right? Also, if you make your information good enough, well, it can be used for better things also. It can be used for AI visibility. You can make sure that you don't over-raycast for nothing, so you don't make your AI too smart so it can headshot you through walls at any moment. And then it's also used for sound propagation, which is a really huge feature in Rainbow Six Siege. So depending on, parallel openings and walls, it'll change the acoustic of rooms. And it's a really important feature of the game because players really rely on that. And then they're relying on the high quality of the information we give them. And finally, well, it's a game. Every gameplay programmer is going to expect some kind of behavior sometimes, right? You want something that will break all the time and not rely on chance or, procedural destruction. You need to feed that. You need to address that kind of problem because we're making a game. It's not just a tech, it's a game, right? So there's a lot of things you need to think about, but in the end, if you do that, it's really manageable. So all right, a bit more about the Realblast tech. This will be pretty high level, of course. I mean, if you do destruction technology, it could be super different, it could be super similar, but in the end, prefrag models are pretty similar. So our basic concept is simple. Objects that are made of different parts should be modeled differently, or separately in your objects. That, I guess, it does seem logic. You don't grow glass out of trees, or everything's made of different parts, and you can put a lot of effort and intelligence in your materials. And then, once everything's modeled in different parts, it's super easy to do fragmentation. It'll be coherent. It'll make sense physically. And on that topic, fragmentation itself, it creates a hierarchy, right? You start from something not broken, and then you break it in multiple parts. The intermediate steps, you can actually keep them and reuse them for efficient rendering or efficient physics, which is something we do. And finally, you want to have some kind of destruction model so you can simulate your state of your objects in there. So the thing we did is really simple, right? The fragments, the leaf fragments in your tree are nodes in a graph. And the edges in the graph are physical connections between fragments. So if you have that, then you end up with a really nice graph. And everyone knows what a graph is. There's plenty of algorithms in graph. You can use, min flow, max flow, and min cuts, for example. And a lot of interesting algorithms, and it's a good concept to talk about. And then that graph, you can use it to manage the state of your objects. If connections are broken or edges in your graphs, well, it means that things aren't touching anymore. They can be totally independent objects in your game later on. And furthermore, you can actually integrate your procedural destruction in that kind of model. You can just decide that your leaves are, let's say, they're procedurally destructible, depending on your topology or your techniques. And then their visual can change, their collision can change. You can remove them from the graph and replace them with child fragments. And that works really nicely with a fully coherent model. So what about the special thing we did for Rainbow Six? Well, we developed something which we call surface destruction, exclusively for Rainbow Six. We started from the glass and generalized and everything. But it might sound like limiting that you say, oh, it works only on planar-like objects. But in practice, in closed environments and wall and houses and everything, there's a lot of planes around. And the great strength of it is that you can use whatever you want to cut it. It's super easy to have your artists come up with a model or generate new models mathematically that will create 2D patterns. And in general, as far as the algorithms go, it's pretty robust, it's fast, it's not too hard to implement. Conceptually, it's pretty simple. So how would you actually do that? Well, first step, you take your planar-like object, you just take a 2D model out of it. You just find a projection basis, you project it, that's it. Then, let's say later you get some input from the gameplay. You correlate the input with your material. You decide it should break this way or that kind of pattern. You generate the pattern. You end up with new polygons, and then you intersect your 2D polygons with your cutter. So you can use a lot of algorithms. I mean, it's nothing new as far as 3D is concerned, but for example, where Asherton is really simple conceptually, and you can generalize it to work for pretty complex polygons. And once you're done with that, you can interpolate new properties, new UVs, and so on. But in the end, you want to push it to the physics or to the rendering, so you triangulate. There's a lot of solutions for triangulation. You could use the Delaunay or any other algorithms. As far as the Rainbow Six is concerned, we use ear clipping. It's not the most optimal algorithm, that's for sure, but it's pretty robust, and it did handle the most common cases, which was really simple, small holes in the walls. So that was a great success for us. So once you're done with the triangulation, well, it's trivial to just make a 3D model out of it. You just extrude, you reuse your projection basis, you just inverse it, and then voila, you have a 3D mesh. So a bit more on the topic of cutters. Well, there's a lot of different cutters out there, or you could think about, but in general, there's really 3 families. You have some that will define a perimeter, like an ellipse or a square or something that could be driven by the gameplay or not. You have some that will define inner fragments, like a Voronoi, and then you have some that might mix a bit of the two, like the glass cutter I've seen you, and also the wood in the video. And actually, the texture cutter was used for the wood. It's a really cool concept, right? You, or the artist, more or less draws exactly what he wants in UV space and a tileable surface. And then once you get the inputs from the gameplay, you can just find where you are in your UV space, do your query, bring that back to 2D space, and use that for your intersection. And you'll have something that's, really interesting, really high detail, and no artist will have to model that manually. So it's a really nice, interesting thing. So what do we have now, except some water? You might end up with something like this. That's programmer art, of course. You have a nice oil. There's a lot of vertices. Looks kind of organic. That's interesting. But there's something missing, right? You want to improve that visual look. So normally, what you would do in some kind of shooting game or whatever, you would use decals or decals or whatever you call them. But we were kind of hoping for a better solution, so we went for something that's a bit more generalized, which we call decorations. Essentially, these are really full geometry. They can be either managed like surfaces, but that are going to be only 2D. And then you can place them however you want. You can be inside of transparency objects. They can be placed on top, back, what have you. So they're super flexible, and you can actually manage them through the lifetime of your wall or your object. If it splits in multiple parts, you can still keep them. It's easy to manage. But on the flip side, you'll pay more for that, either CPU, rendering, or memory. And the good thing also that it kind of feels like a normal thing for artists also to work with. They're used to placing decals and visual stuff on walls or just to dress up. So there's basically 2 types of decorations. You have the ones that are really decal-like, so they're really basically stickers on the surface. They'll get they can get cut along with the surface. And that's pretty easy to manage. And then you can have some that are really bound on the features. So either vertices or edges. So you can place things inside and place some filler. And the trick about it is that once the feature they're attached to is gone, well, you can just remove them. It's easy to look up whether your edge is still present or your vertex is still present. So that's a really good way to approach the problem. So that might end up with something like this. Definitely looks better. It's still programmer art, but I mean, these are real textures. It looks like what you're expecting. You still keep the real procedural feel of it, and it's still looking a bit better. So in practice, I mean, in the game, it can look something like this. So that's interesting. All right, performance now. As you might know, Rainbow Six Siege is really running at 60 FPS in PvP. So just that by itself is a huge challenge, and that's even without destruction. So let's say you go forward with destruction, you've done what you needed to give the info. Well, that's still going to impact the other systems. Your AI, your navigation, your sound variation, they kind of need to be dynamic now. So they will need to invest some time and some effort into that. The rendering side, you can barely use static lighting. You have a lot more dynamic shadows. You have less occluders because your walls might be broken at any moment, and you can see more objects because your walls can be broken at any minute. So that topic is complex by itself. So if you guys are interested in that, you can go see Jala's talk. Actually, just after the talk at 3:30, I'm sure it'll be really interesting. So what about physics? Once you've destroyed something, the physics shapes are really bound to be really concave. So you might think, okay, I'll just use the visual for that and let my physics middleware do it. That's really going to be super costly. So you don't want to head towards that. So what you can do is you can massage your data a bit. You can remove the small holes because they're not really useful. You won't be able to navigate through them anyway. You can reduce tessellation, but you got to be careful about the original shape of the surface. And then you can do a lot of other things. We went for some kind of a collection of convex shapes. So because we know the front and back planes, then we only do like convex holes in 2D, so it's faster. All right, so what about debris? I guess you guys might have played the game. There's a lot of debris in the game when you've this full, huge destruction. And that's all non-procedurally cut debris. We decided pretty early in the project that this would be a cost we could actually avoid. So if you remember, again, back to the event system or the output, if you give a lot of good quality outputs, you can place really nice meshes at the right places with the right physics. It'll look really good. And then you can instance those and you can recycle them super aggressively, and that'll make it really tractable as far as physics is concerned. So, other tricks, you can make sure that dynamic fragments won't collide together. You have an explosion in something that's super complex. Maybe you don't need to see the 500 fragments in the end. Maybe 4 of them is going to be sufficient. And you can also, of course, use boxes all the time. And if you're lucky, you can use AVOC effects for really small details. All right, so what about destruction performance itself? Drink some water first. As I said before, Rainbow Six Siege, 60 FPS. That was a given, and it was requested of us that we do not impact frame rate. That sounds simple. Of course, it is not, but this section is about it. And we need to be deterministic for online play because every player should see the same thing. So as far as budgets are concerned, we didn't really have a clear budget on pre-fragmented destruction because it was a really big risk. I mean, we'd shipped Black Flag before, and it's easy to manage. But procedural destruction, that was a different beast altogether. So we were given roughly 6 milliseconds for a wall. So really 2 procedural layers. As far as memory is concerned, approximately 25 megs on the GPU and 350 megs of memory. Memory itself was not a huge issue during production. We made sure to keep our footprint as lean as possible, but in the end, that was not where we put a lot of effort. Really, we worked a lot on performance. I mean, it was the most risky part. We had issues for a while because it's really data-driven, right? If the artist decided that it should be super complex and really cool looking, well, it might cost something in the end. And one thing, though, it was really punctual. So we used a collection of techniques and ideas to make it work. So first, you might think, okay, I'll just multi-thread everything. That works. I mean, it's super trivial to make sure that on the object basis, destruction works independently. Maybe you can go a bit farther and make sure that, once your objects are broken in multiple parts, all of these can be simulated independently. That'll work also. Then you can make sure that procedural destruction itself, if you have multiple destruction and to do in the same object, you can multi-thread them. That'll work also, but still not enough. You can go further for multi-threaded algorithms, but that's a lot of effort, which we didn't do. What we did instead is really make destruction synchronous. That made destruction really manageable. Because even if we said, okay, in this case, at the moment, it's taking 100 milliseconds, it doesn't affect the gameplay feel. It doesn't affect the rendering. So that really, the blood pressure of a lot of people in the project lowered quite a bit. Of course, you've bad thing related to that. You have some delay in the actual game perception and the destruction itself. But, with effects and an event forwarding mechanism, because, the engine's always seeing something from the past, potentially, that'll work anyway. So in practice, how you can do that is that, your engine's taking you every frame, so you get woken up because you have an input, and you start your update job. And you send that to some kind of a synchronous job scheduler that's not going to mess up too much with the rest of the engine. And then you got to talk with your engine guys. And then you say, okay, I don't need to update until my jobs are done. And then later on, you say, I'm done. I push my results in the engine, and that's it. So you see it does introduce some kind of lag. But if your destruction is not too slow, it's going to be barely noticeable. And one thing you can actually do, which is really cool, is you can do pre-destruction. So if you know destruction is coming along in, 10 frames because the player is starting the animation for an explosion, you might as well do it early so that it really syncs up with the end of your animation. So similarly, you get the input from the gameplay, but early, and with some kind of sync mechanism. And then you start your thing, and once the gameplay says, oh, I want my results now, then you just push the results. And that we did, for example, for the sheet charges, and it worked really nicely. We could actually have put a lot more details in those, and that would have worked. Of course, might impact some other systems, so we didn't do it, but that's something we could have done. All right, next up, time slicing. If the destruction is asynchronous and you're still taking 100 milliseconds, well, your engine guys are not going to like you. Because you might be pushing, he says it, you might be pushing other things that were in a critical path. So you might end up affecting your frame rate. So one thing you can do is that you can make sure that you can split up your work in smaller parts. So that'll have the side effect that might take more time in the long term because you'll have the overhead of being scheduled more, but that really helps out. So what we did is really we split in multiple steps, the basic level, and then we went with more complex time slicing in the lower levels. So there's no really super obvious solution in C++, and there's a start here, because yes, I know about features, and then maybe you could just stop your threads or something, but we're in a game environment. We try to be scheduler friendly, so we're scheduled like everything else. So what you can do, and what we did, is that you keep some kind of state variable, a pretty huge state variable that says exactly where you are and what you're doing. But you can actually like make it so that this is a really huge thing that you can use for temporary arrays. So in the end, it's useful because you'll have less allocations. So in practice, you might have something like this. Yeah, you can see the code. That's good. That's a really super simple example. In our code, it doesn't look like this, but you can have macros that you can turn off easily. And you have some kind of state variable that can be either hidden or visible, and you can check whether you've time left to continue working, and essentially just hide some kind of do while with a switch. That works really nicely. But then you're trying to debug, and it's super painful to debug, because you do a few steps and then it goes out and come in, and then you do another few steps, and it's really super painful. But, if you have a macro or something, you can turn it off. Well, you might as well do it. Because in the end, if you need to debug your algorithms, you don't want to, suffer the cost of context switching yourself. So, in general, it will help you debug all your problems, and that's a great way to make it work. So, I've talked about the synchronicity, time scaling, and so on. But in general, once that's really working correctly, you get a point where you can actually run the full engine release. You can run your destruction code in the bug, and you won't even notice it. So I guess it proves the point that it's useful. So, optimization. There's always going to be your boss or the engine team saying, your code could be faster, or algorithms could be faster. So, of course, you're expected to optimize. That's given. It's the games industry after all. But you can make it maybe a bit smarter. If you can measure your performance and then optimize your bottlenecks, you're really making it better. So we're super lucky in Rainbow Six with a great expertise by Ratio that developed telemetry and captures for testers, game sessions, and with automatic tests and everything. That made it really, I wouldn't say easy, but it was simpler to find our problems. So if you guys are interested in that, I would really advise you to see Various Talk, which is unified telemetry, building an infrastructure for big data and games development, tomorrow at 5:30. And Various is a really cool guy also. All right, next up, limit degenerate cases. That sounds logic. But you need to talk to the artists, and maybe you don't talk always the same language, so you kind of need to do some training about that. And then you can also disable features that you don't need. For example, the copper example, maybe after an explosion, whatever parts are on the ground, they might not need to react a lot except being pushed away from the physics. And then finally, you can be creative about it. You can have features that will help you bound complexity. So one example we did is the self-destruction. So when a player shoots multiple bullets near, so instead of making it so it looks like cheese, we decided we'll make a bigger hole. Because in the end, it just looks better, and the designer guys like it, the players like it, and it's better for performance. So might as well do it. All right, next up, runtime allocations. That's something we fixed later in the project, where I get not too lazy, but not too super careful about it. But runtime allocations, they do cost something, because most of the time you'll lock in multi-trillion environments for your allocator, so that does have a cost. Of course, in some cases you have no choice; you need to allocate because it's something you're going to keep forever. But you can have some kind of better strategies. You can have hybrid heap stack arrays, so for some things that you expect that most of the time will be small. You can have working data structures, really big buffers for your work, or you can have pools of short-lived objects. For example, the events I was talking about, they don't live that long. They have a couple of frames, so instead of creating new ones, deleting them, you can just keep them. And of course, you can have in-place algorithms. All right, so as far as benchmarks go, these are really not, I wouldn't stake my life on it. We benchmark a couple of times at most. So take with a heap of salt. So on PC, it's kind of fast. Bullets are pretty cheap. Just so we're clear, the first number is actual procedural destruction. Second number is the visual update and the physics update. So as far as bullet holes are concerned, we never change the physics. So it's pretty cheap. For explosions, well, it comes a bit more because we do change a lot more things. So on PC, we're still way under the approximate 3 milliseconds mark. But you know, when you put in more things like walls with layers of wood on top and everything, it kind of goes a bit crazy. But we're synchronous. It'll happen 2 frames later, 3 frames later, and the engine guys aren't too angry about it. All right, so what about online now? As I said before, if you have a gameplay feature, it needs to be deterministic because every player needs to see it the same way or experience it the same way. And of course, that means it needs to be replicated. So you might think, oh, I'll just send all my meshes over the network. Well, that's not really going to work. You're still always trying to minimize bandwidth usage. So instead of, doing that, we just send events over the network, and then we expect the destruction system to be entirely deterministic. That itself is somewhat of a problem, but we'll come to that later. As far as physics are concerned, the rule of thumb here is don't do it. You've seen it, destruction is asynchronous, so just syncing when destruction is happening or finishing, not going to be super simple. Characters will impact your dynamic object, so that's a problem by itself. So if you don't need to do it, don't do it. As far as Rainbow Six is concerned, every dynamic object is really small, doesn't impact gameplay. So, shooting goes through. Destruction on dynamic objects is not even replicated because it might not make sense for the other players. So back to determinism. What we did is we established a contract between the game and destruction system. So we ask for the same inputs, exactly the same inputs, in the same order. So we made it so that our system would actually react well to that. So same inputs, hey, that's trivial, right? Yeah, maybe not. A lot of the times you'll have data compression because maybe you don't need the full range of values. But if you do that, then locally you also need to apply data compression. And then if you're a client, you compress your data, send it to the host, looks at it, so we compress it, uncompresses it, and then recompresses it and sends it to another client. Well, everyone needs to have exactly the same value. So you need to have some kind of symmetric compression. Doesn't mean lossless. The first compression will lose some information, but if you just stick around with compressed values, you shouldn't always end up with the same thing. So that's what I actually written there here. As far as ordering is concerned, normally that's not too complex. We were lucky on Rainbow Six Siege. The network layer was guaranteeing that, so we didn't have to do anything. But you might have network bursts and everything, so you need to make it so that your destruction is not sensitive to having multiple inputs in the same frame. So that's one thing. You can possibly just process one every frame, and maybe that'll work out. As far as randomness is concerned, we're talking about procedural destruction, so you think the outcome must be unique, whatever happens. Well, if you want to still have that kind of randomness input or randomness feeling, well, you can have a random number generator. That's really based on some kind of common value you can use. So in Rainbow Six Siege, with perfect replication of inputs, the actual hit position, that's really going to be a pretty good value. So you can use that and seed your random number generator in there. And if your granularity is good enough, no one's ever going to notice that it's not totally random. And as far as random number generators are used in C++, you can store them in thread local storage. It makes it super easy to use. Just gotta take some care about time slicing. All right, so what about different states? You have messages from the past from other clients, or when you're the host, for example, or just because you're asynchronous. Or you can have messages from the future because the host is quite possibly advanced than you. So you need to be tolerant of that and robust. So in our case, we have some kind of history of what happened before, so we can not roll back, but retarget inputs. And then we have some kind of mechanism on the information we have, so we can roll back for expected past values. That's it for that. So what about instant feedback? You know, when you play shooter, you expect some kind of instant feedback on shooting. So in the context of Rainbow Six Siege, you expect to have a hole when you shoot something, if it's supposed to break, of course. So when you play on LAN, maybe sending your message to the host and getting back might not be that much of a problem. When you're playing on the internet, that's a lot of latency, so you can't actually make it work this way. But if you do destruction locally, then it does break ordering. So the game broke its contract. So how do you actually cope with that? Well, initially it was a really problem, because you've seen the self-destruction feature before. You know, a lot of small holes becomes a bigger hole. Well, if the ordering of that changes, you might end up with a really different hole, and then everyone's just diverging to different values, and it just breaks the game. So what we did is, well, we separated that feature in two parts. Well, there's the small hole happening, and then there's the actual damage for the surface. That's going to be used for the bigger damage. So as far as this is concerned, you're the originator, you shoot on something, you do the small hole, and then you send the message to the host with the full information. And the host sends back the message to everyone, but you get the special message just for you. You just do the damage thing for the bigger holes. And then that makes it that every damage that's dealt is always gone through the host, so it's fully ordered. So you might think, well, it's not a really perfect solution. You might end up with something different. You know, the originator might have some small differences in the visuals, or might have, if the holes are really wrongly made or too big or something, it might end up different. But in practice, we've done a lot of tests, and we end up with the same number of vertices in the same places. You know, you might have some small differences, but it's so minimal that it is not a problem. Okay, other solutions. There was talk at some point, well, maybe that's not good enough. So we thought about the solution that would be really a good solution, super robust. We called it the rollback. Essentially, if you're a client and you do something locally, you keep track of it. And then when you receive messages from the host, if they're not messages from your stack, you undo your changes, you apply the host messages, and redo your messages. That seems super logical. That'll work. Well, of course, when you get a message that's your message, you just remove it from your stack. But that'll work really nicely if your latency is not too bad, because your stack might become really, really, really tall, and then just undoing the work and redoing the work, that might be a lot of effort you're wasting. That might not be good for you. So, of course, we didn't do it. We might actually think about it for LAN environments in the future, but so far, so good. So, I know I talk really fast, but I'm kind of at the end now. So, what about future? You know, I talk very briefly about tools, but we're still in process and making it easy and fun to work with, because there's a lot of things you can do, right? For every different input, you can have a different output. So how do you actually present that to the artists and make it clear? That's some work in itself. We've also worked on curved surfaces, so we, let's say, extended a bit the concept so we can have curved walls and so on. And we actually already shipped that in season 1 for Rainbow Six. And then there might be other destruction types we can go with. You know, plastic deformation, stress analysis, fully 3D Boolean technique. And in general, just optimize and make it look better. So that's kind of concludes the talk. So what about takeaways? If you want to do destruction, give yourself a favor and take a full team fit. There's so many different technical fronts. You know, whether that's your technical, you know, your runtime destruction, or the impact you have in gameplay or in the tools, you really need multiple people working on that. And then you'll need also some kind of technical advisory for the artists. They'll need training, that's for sure. And then you also need a really clear production buy-in. You know, you might come up with the really best technique whatsoever if the production says, I don't think we have the budget to, you know, pimp the AI so it works, it's not going to make it in the game. So, as far as the, you know, environments or destructible environments are concerned, you got to do it really early because it's a lot of investment and there's a lot of inertia to fight sometimes also. So, finally, dynamic environments like destructible or, you know, just living environments, they're here to stay. We're not going backwards to fully static worlds, so you might as well embrace it. And of course, destruction's awesome, kick ass. So promote innovation and change, bite the bullet, do it. All right, finally, remember John's talk tomorrow at 3:30, Maurice's talk tomorrow at 5:30, and you guys can reach me at julien.leroux, at ubisoft.com for questions or 8 mails or love letters. I am open for it. Any questions?
What are your thoughts in general on sparse voxels and how that compares to your technique, both in terms of performance and ease of implementation?
That's a really interesting question. As far as voxels and sparse voxels in general, I'm sure that they're really great, but you might not end up exactly with the visual look you want, and it's a huge step for an engine to switch to voxels. If they're actually working on a game whatsoever, and then that's a lot of inertia when you're in a somewhat big company. It's a huge, huge change. So when you work on really like normal geometry or meshes, it makes it, let's say, more swallowable, you know, more simpler for them to accept it.
Okay.
Yep. Other questions? I mean, if you're too shy, I'll stick around for a couple of minutes, or you can actually meet me and Alex at the Ubisoft Lounge at 4. We'll talk a bit about tools and answer questions in general. All right? Thank you. Have a good evening.